Sexual assault is the only crime of any crime that gets reported that we start from a place of being skeptical of the victim, where we force the victim to prove that it occurred before we're going to take them seriously. That doesn't happen in a homicide, that doesn't happen in a robbery, it doesn't happen in any other claim.
I don't know how they call it survival, but I'm alive, so I guess that means I'm a survivor. I'm Shanna Harker, rape survivalist. I met Mason on an online app. He was so shy, and he was so sweet, and he was going on and on about how he'd been hurt so much by women, and he could see why women felt the way they did because he'd been hurt so many times, so he understood why women were so vulnerable. And you could really relate to where he was coming from.
My name's Janelle Malone. I'm the director of the Crime Victim Assistance Division here in the Iowa Attorney General's office. So we kind of had conversations here in-house, and we wanted to find out just on our own if this was in fact a problem in Iowa's law enforcement agencies. So we started what we would call an audit, and we had basically tried to put together kind of a questionnaire that we could send out to every law enforcement agency, asking them how many kids they had, why they had them, and whether or not they were tested or untested, why hadn't they been tested. And we were probably about 6 months into creating that questionnaire when we were in legislative session and legislators started asking the same questions. And in the interim, finding out from our peers across the country that this is a very expensive issue to tackle, whether it be the audit or it be the actual, you find out how many kits you have, and then the actual testing of those kits is very, very expensive. So we applied to the Bureau of Justice Assistance at the federal level for one of their SAKI grants, which is the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative grants. And we were successful in obtaining that. So this was almost like all happening at the same time. So we received a $2 million award. $1 million of it can be used for testing kits, and $1 million of it has to be used towards essentially whatever you're doing to create solutions. So from the investigation and prosecution of whatever stems from the testing of those kits, also if there's any systemic type changes that we could make.
So my story started when I was maybe 10, 11. Honestly, don't remember exactly when. I believe we were in 7th grade. And I don't even remember the first time it happened that my stepdad had started touching me.
My name is Chuck Senard. I am the Dallas County, Iowa County Attorney, the elected official for this jurisdiction. I was elected in 2019 to serve as county attorney. Before that, though, I had been an assistant county attorney, so a deputy prosecutor in this office for the prior 18 years. So I'm just entering my 20th year of prosecution.
My name is Brandy Werner, and I'm a voice from experience of sexual trauma. Guess probably, it was started before I can remember. So the earliest memory I have, I want to say I was 3. And it kept going until I was in 4th grade.
So how many untested kids were found in Iowa?
So when we completed the audit, we found that there were 4,265 untested kits on the shelves of law enforcement in Iowa. I mentioned there's 387 active law enforcement agencies. Of those, 168 had kits. The main reasons were that the victim didn't want to file charges, and the second highest reason was that law enforcement doubted the truthfulness of the accusation.
When you talk about a role of a prosecutor, maybe the most daunting task or power entrusted to a prosecutor is discretion, what we call prosecutorial discretion. The prosecutor is the chief law enforcement officer in a county in Iowa. Within their jurisdiction, they're responsible for screening potential cases for charging, for making charging decisions, and then subsequently making decisions about the disposition of a case once it gets that far. And there is a lot of discretion given to the prosecutor to make those determinations at each stage.
I do believe that overall law enforcement want to do the right thing. And so I always start from a place of assuming the best in people. When we saw some of these reports, it was abundantly clear if an officer didn't believe a victim. Some of the language that got put into reports was a little bit appalling from a standpoint of an individual who's worked in victim services for a very long time. I think it was a little shocking just how rampant the culture is to not believe a victim. And I'm not saying that there aren't ever any false reports, but the best research shows that it's like less than 6 or 7% of the time.
We used to live in an old farmhouse, and there wasn't heat upstairs on the second floor, and so I would sleep in the living room on the couch. And when I did that, he sometimes just started coming out in the living room in the middle of the night, and he would just start touching me, and it would just go a little further, and sometimes he would insert a finger or two. He had performed oral sex on me, and that's something that I never brought up, and I don't know why I didn't. I didn't quite understand what it was and the difference between the things that he had done. Maybe he had gotten in more trouble if I had said that. I don't know. I kind of regret that now. But from what I remember and from not blacking out the instances, it went on for about a year.
We really need more education for everybody in those areas so people can all understand the psychology of what's happening here and why people made the decisions that they made, and that those were the decisions they had to make in those moments to maybe protect themselves or someone they loved. But at the same time, just because those decisions were made doesn't mean that they consented to be sexually abused.
I had a neighbor who was a friend of mine that had told me that she was in foster care, and she had told me that she was being sexually abused by her foster parents, and so were her siblings. And her and I made a pact together that we would tell my parents, both of us, what was going on. That way everything could be out in the open. And so we did. We went inside and we told my parents about her first, and of course I immediately called the cops. And the cops came and removed the kids from the home. And later that night, I pulled my stepdad aside and let him know that what my brother had been doing, and he called me a liar.
I sponsored legislation that would eliminate the criminal statute of limitations for child sexual abuse, just as we have no criminal statute of limitations for murder in our state.
The statute of limitations is a legislative determination that, at least in the civil context, that an individual will have a certain period of time in which to file a civil lawsuit to right any kind of transgression against their rights. In most cases, the statute of limitations is relatively easy to apply. If we have a car accident, we know we had the car accident. We've got 2 cars that are mangled up. So our clock starts ticking that day. And we have a limited period of time, 2 years or maybe 4 years in certain instances in which to bring an action. But oftentimes the complicating factor here is that the perpetrator of this abuse is an adult abusing a child, and oftentimes that adult is someone who's a trusted figure in that child's life. And so there may be nobody to tell, or even if they do tell, their parents won't believe it or can't believe it. I mean, so it depends on kind of who the perpetrator is and what organization he or she works for.
He's like, well, let's go camping this weekend. And it was like Thursday night. And he was talking about, Friday morning, Saturday and Sunday or something like that. I don't know. I just know. We talked on the 20th, we went camping the 21st. I reported it the 22nd. And he's like, I have my tractor and this tractor pull. You come watch me. I'm thinking, great. It's public. We've been talking for months, on Meet Me and off Meet Me. I've been talking to him on Snapchat, video conferencing for months. So I thought, I had a pretty good hold on to who this guy was. So, like 3 or 4 hours later, it's probably about 4 or 5 o'clock-ish, threw on our swimsuits and went swimming. He was very respectable about that. He let me go in the tent, put on my swimsuit. He even stayed all the way over by my Jeep while I did so.
We, as a culture, constantly put our immediate focus on what the victim did or didn't do leading up to that assault before we determine the worthiness.
Then we went to the tent. I brought my tablet. It has Vudu and Hulu and Netflix on it, the things I have. And that way we could watch something. He's like, oh, we can watch something later. I'm like, okay. That's when he went off script. This other person, it's like it just washed over him. The gentleness in his face and his eyes were gone. He was gone. And this other person was there. There's no warning. It's too late.
I think we still have a long ways to go. Even in light of the MeToo movement and many of the high-profile sexual abuse cases that have come up in recent years, Larry Nassar, Harvey Weinstein, even in the face of all those, there, I think, is still a lot of education of the public to do.
So when we send these kits in to be tested, they get tested by a lab that has to be vetted by the FBI. And then once they test it and determine if there's a usable DNA profile, all of their results go to a second entity for what we call a technical review. And then if those results are verified, they come back to our state lab, and then it's up to the state lab to determine whether or not the DNA profile gets uploaded into the federal CODIS system. we've done that on a number of cases, and so far we have 105 hits is what we call. So 105 profiles that went into CODIS and hit to a sexual assault, or hit to a known offender, or hit to an offender listed in another sexual assault case, maybe unknown. What's been really, really shocking is, of those ones that we've gotten back, how easy it still is to dismiss doing anything additional with that information. And that's been hard.
He had mentioned once, after it had been happening for a while, basically that he wanted to have sex with me, but he never would until I was 18 because he knew that was wrong. And that statement stands out to this day. And I'm just like, whoa, I would never say anything when it happened, even when he said things to me during the act. I just kind of laid there in silence. There were times that I would pretend I was on my period and wear a pad just so that he would feel that and not want to go any further. I tried to stop it, I guess, in my own way with that, but eventually it just got too much and I had to tell. And then one day I just decided to tell Natalie Montross at school. And from there, I sat in her office all day long at school. The police came and interviewed me. I was interviewed by lots of people that day. He actually ended up coming to the school. They wouldn't let him see me, and he called his attorney. And that was the last time I'd seen him. That was it.
I caught my brother peeking under a bathroom door at me as an adult and knew that something had to be said. So again, I brought it up a second time, and as a 22-year-old woman, and was told again that I was looking for attention. So this obviously was seemed to be a lifelong battle. I wasn't looking for attention. I actually had mentioned something because my brother had a girlfriend with 4 children at that point, and there was one of the little girls that I was concerned about. And come to find out a couple months later, actually, that he had been sexually molesting her daughter for quite a while. So.
Current law in Iowa allows a survivor of child sexual abuse to go after the perpetrator for criminal charges 15 years after they reach the age of majority. So 18 plus 15. If there's DNA evidence, there's also an additional 3-year window from the time of the DNA evidence. Currently, Iowa's civil statute of limitations laws are very weak. They definitely benefit the organization that's covered up the crime. And a child who's sexually abused by a therapist, a counselor, or school personnel, a school employee has only 5 years from the time they end therapy or leave that school. So essentially, a child that maybe was abused as a kindergartner, their statute of limitation would run out before they even reach the 6th grade to go after that institution for civil damages. Otherwise, all other child sexual abuse survivors have until their 19th birthday, which is woefully inadequate. Our civil statute of limitations laws benefit organizations that cover up the crime instead of providing rights to survivors of child sexual abuse. My legislation to eliminate the criminal statute of limitations, we passed legislation that expanded the civil statute of limitations out of the Iowa Senate, but it hit a roadblock in the Iowa House of Representatives. The legislation that I sponsored to eliminate the criminal statute of limitations did not even receive a hearing.
The date of the event and the date of the realization of when the action accrues are not the same, or virtually never the same, in these cases of childhood sexual abuse. It isn't. It's a lot different than if I, break my arm. We can go to the doctor's office and see I've got a broken arm. Get an X-ray of it and know immediately what the ramifications of that accident were. But that's not always the case. It's rarely the case, frankly, in a situation where a child is abused by an adult.
He woke up. He wanted me to take him somewhere to get breakfast, like nothing happened. Nothing happened. And then I was supposed to follow him. He was driving his tractor to his uncle's. And that's when I called 911.
911, what's the location of your emergency? This is Story County. I'm going to transfer you a call. Evidently, the girl on the phone with me said that she was raped at Little Wall Lake last night. The subject has a tractor. All right. Ma'am?
Last night this happened. Do you know the man's name?
Yeah. Who is he? I'm scared. He has a bad temper. He's already in so much trouble, I guess. I don't want to make it worse, but what he did was wrong.
Right. Well, I'm going to have you talk to the deputy, and you talk it over with him, and you can decide there what you want to do. Hamilton County cars. I'm going to stay on the...
really bad, and I'm really sore.
Okay, Shanna, I'm going to stay on the phone with you just a moment. I have a subject reporting an assault that happened last night at Little Wall Lake. She's down on 400th Street and George Washington Avenue, just into our county from Story County line. I'm going to let you talk to the deputy so that you can decide, after you talk to him, what avenue you want to pursue this in, okay? Are you injured?
Okay.
Do you need an ambulance?
I'm in pain.
Okay, the deputy says I need you to go back up to the lake to make the report is where he'll meet you, but this Mason isn't there at the lake anymore, is he?
No.
Okay, good. All right. So I'll have you go back to Little Wall Lake and wait there for him.
I had all his stuff in the back of my Jeep. The tent, the blankets, the pillows, the swim trunks. How could I leave him? How could I desert him like that? After everything he's told me from women hurting him. Women hurting him. Excuse me? I'm deserting him, I'm hurting him, and what just freaking did he do to me? What's worse is the damn police on the phone had me go back to the damn campground to make the report. And he took my statement with his recorder cam on his thing, and then I had to write it out. They wanted it in writing. Well, apparently I did fine in the detail before and fine in the detail after, but not so much detail during, or how we got there. Whatever. How am I supposed to just be no problem with that? Just finally got away from this man. I'm in pain, I'm bleeding, he's beating the crap out of me, I got bruises from head to toe. 2 hours later and 4 pages. And they drive me to Webster City's hospital.
I grew up in the 80s, And that was a time when no means no first kind of became very widespread and known in the public. And that message is still relevant today. It doesn't matter how you dress. It doesn't matter whether you drink. In regards to whether a person has the right to touch you without your consent. That is ultimately what determines, in many cases, whether there is a sex abuse allegation or not. Did the person knowingly and voluntarily consent to that sex act? That's what matters. To a prosecutor, that should be all that matters.
So my mom found out after I told. She had no clue, and I know to this day that she regrets it, and she probably blamed herself back then because she had no clue it was going on. My mom also had her own issues, and she had battled addiction on and off. Sometimes back then I wonder if she was still using meth, and so maybe that could have been part of why she was in her own little world and didn't really know. He was a massive alcoholic. He would come home drunk every night, and so I'm sure in his drunken escapades, that's when a lot of this happened too. I was scared to have friends come over because I didn't want something to happen to them or them to see him doing something to me. Like, how do you explain that to one of your best friends? I remember going to Iowa City a couple times with my mom and a police escort to do interviews there. I'm pretty sure they threatened to take me away from my mom and my other sisters, and I'm not sure if it's because of, again, if she was using then because she hid it kind of well, or if there was more to it along with the abuse. I know he didn't do anything to my sisters, and I've even clarified that to this day. But they definitely, I remember my mom crying on the way home from Iowa City, which was like a week after I told. Just that they were threatening to take us away, and she was confused. The night that I told, I know that he did go back to the house. I stayed at my grandma's for a few weeks after that, and I know he went to the house, and my aunts and uncles and all kind of rallied together and went out there, and the cops were called, and they were all going to beat him up. And they still wish that they could have. My mom defended him in that sense then, and I mean, I'm sure she was really confused too. I could only imagine somebody that you thought you loved and was taking care of you very well financially turns out to be a monster. And it's like, how do you handle that?
I think the biggest obstacles that we faced on getting rid of the criminal statute of limitations is educating people. I don't think people realize how difficult it is for survivors to come forward and face their perpetrators and face the horrific, traumatic experiences that they had as a child. And we just need to do a better job of educating other fellow lawmakers about why it is so important to give survivors an opportunity to seek justice.
I do think the culture's shifting, but not quickly enough. And I think there's a huge gap where education needs to be filled. Education for law enforcement, again, on like trauma-informed victim interviewing, trauma and the effects on the brain, that there isn't, while there are some generalities that can be made, there isn't a typical victim. Everybody presents differently, and some people shut down, some people are extremely emotional, some people are very closed off and numb. I mean, it's just, you can't go in thinking that every victim has to look a certain way or behave a certain way to have been victimized. So I think there's just educating across the board. I think there's educating with prosecution and helping them understand how to put one of these cases together in a way that could result in a conviction. Because we know something like 4% or less of these cases ever get tried. And of those, something like 1% of offenders that actually get held accountable and serve any prison time or jail time. We definitely, through this process, there's really only two defenses to sexual assault. It didn't happen, or it was consensual. in the event that it doesn't happen, I think law enforcement have done an offender says it didn't happen, law enforcement have done a pretty good job of understanding how to proceed in those cases. Because obviously then if there is DNA, if there are, bodily fluids that show up in a kit that's been tested, it becomes harder for an offender to say that he or she wasn't there. But when it comes to it was consensual, we've really struggled as a profession when it comes to law enforcement. We've really struggled to figure out how to deal with that. And in many cases, that's as far as the investigation goes. I interviewed her, she said she was raped. I interviewed him, he said it was consensual. I don't know, there's nothing more that can be done here. Whereas we know that that's not actually the case. There is quite a bit that can be done after that. I always say that, those are frequently called he said, she said cases, but it's not really he said, she said, because it's really just he said if that's as far as it goes. Then you're inherently then believing the offender's version of what happened.
My brother was on the sex offenders registry for 10 years. He's no longer on the registry. And of course, my family kept it quiet, brushed it under the rug, because it's not really something that a family's proud of. But when you brush that under the rug, you create an unsafe environment for other children. You create a false sense of security, like I said, for people who have children who do not know the character of somebody that they're around. And so that's where I just feel like people really need to start speaking up, and they really need to come forth and hold people accountable for their actions, no matter how hard it is for a family. Not only did I have the trauma from my brother, as I've mentioned, but when I was 18, I was in a bad place emotionally, and I was self-medicating with alcohol. During the self-medication, I would get into very drunk states where I did not know what was going on. And one of the experiences that I had is that I thought I was out with friends, male friends, and I passed out, and I woke up and they were taking turns on me. And of course I had no idea what was going on, and I just immediately started bawling and ran in the other room and came to enough to get my clothes on and leave. And the next day, of course, there were rumors going around, and luckily there wasn't social media at that point, because who knows what would have been on there. However, that point I was very upset, obviously, and actually went after both of the guys personally. And one of them I chased with a crowbar because I was going to beat the shit out of him, and he got away from me. The other guy wasn't so lucky. There were some individuals in town who got a hold of him and ended up beating him up pretty good. Unfortunately, I didn't know what exactly had happened because I was so intoxicated, and I just remember waking up, and I should have went to the cops, and I didn't. Again, another reason why you don't stay silent. So I didn't feel at that point that I really had enough evidence or enough knowledge of what exactly happened to go to the cops. And that was definitely a mistake on my part. Of course, hindsight's 20/20, and there are many things that we would redo and do differently if we knew better at the time. Being 18 and having had the trauma that I had had as a child in my history, I just immediately kept quiet. And that is not something that I recommend anybody do.
A person's level of intoxication may play into their recall, and again, how much they can testify about something, and that may make proving a charge harder and may play into that discussion about plea negotiations or not, if that's all the evidence that you have. But that is never something that is the fault of the victim. That's that's the evidence as it is. You take it as it is, and you do the best you can with the evidence you have, but that is not something to pass blame to somebody else. Responsibility lies with the defendant and solely with the defendant for any sexual abuse.
Yes, the question I think is there a necessity that the perpetrator ever have been charged criminally to be successful in a civil lawsuit? And the answer to that is no. Because you're not trying to enforce the criminal code or the penal code in the state of Iowa. You are bringing a civil action for a wrong or a tort committed by a person or an entity. And so there's no necessity of having anyone ever been filed against criminally. I have a very heart-to-heart talk with all of my clients before we ever even decide to file. And I ask them kind of that question. And the question is always, how do you know if we win? And sometimes they have a feeling or an answer. And the answer that I always suggest is to them, let's look at your past and what made you feel terrible. And 9 out of 10 times it was that, well, I was silent about this abuse, or I was afraid to tell somebody about this abuse, or, I thought I was going to hell if I revealed this abuse. And I think that the answer to your question always is, well, we win when we no longer participate in it. When we say, I'm not gonna continue being part of this cover-up. You guys can do that if you want, but I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to participate, and I'm not going to let you use me to continue your hiding of these facts from the public. And then after that, I think they get a little bit different attitude, because I tell them we win when we file the lawsuit. Doesn't really happen. If we get kicked out of the statute of limitations, we get kicked out. If we don't, we don't. But the second thing I always tell them is that we're never going to win enough money to compensate you for what happened to you. It just isn't going to happen. There isn't enough money in Iowa.
I think that Iowans would be surprised when you look at the organizations that either support or monitor or oppose the legislation, particularly the civil statute of limitations. They may be surprised to see how few organizations have stepped up to put their names on a piece of legislation that they support protecting their children. And it would be nice to see organizations come forward. We know that survivors of child sexual abuse oftentimes go on to have significant problems in adulthood. And if we could get companies and faith organizations and organizations that advocate for our children to step up and sign on as in favor of supporting legislation to get rid of the criminal statute of limitations, I think that they would see a lot healthier population of adults in our state and children in our state.
6 hours non-stop, touching me, prodding me, taking something, taking a sample. Oh my God, it was horrible. I'm not sure what was, well, I know what was worse, but it really makes you wonder though. And when I got home, I came inside and I locked the door and I sat down on my couch and I just mummified. I didn't move. I didn't want to watch TV. I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to do anything. I was a survivor. Yeah, okay. The whole time I was thinking, I just want to live, I just want to live, I just want to live. God, let me live through this. And afterwards, it's just like, why didn't he kill me? Because what's afterwards is almost as bad as going through it.
What we've done now to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore is that, or to make sure that a victim does know what their rights are around the kit, around the exam, we've created a consent form that's now in every single one of the sexual assault kits. It's just, they're put in at the production of. And it's both Spanish and English, and victim's able to walk through it and understand what his or her rights are around the exam, that they can stop the exam at any point, that they can choose to file a report with law enforcement or not choose to file a report with law enforcement, and what happens in both of those scenarios. We now ask them if they want the kit to be tested, because one of the huge issues we had was understanding what the will of the victim was at the time. There's just no way to know unless it was very specific, and even then, like very specifically articulated, and even then we found that there was some subjectivity that can play in on the part of the law enforcement. We know that if a victim feels like he or she's not being believed, or if the conversation is leading towards like, you know how hard this will be, you know, or if, I mean, for all the reasons that we know stigmas around sexual assault exist, people are pretty intuitive. And so if you start feeling like the individual across from you doesn't believe it happened, you can start shutting down, and then that could easily fall into a lack of cooperation, or, you know, these other areas, when really it was just, the vibe I'm getting from you is that this isn't going anywhere, so why am I putting myself through this? And to be dealing with that so quickly after trauma is obviously really hard. Nationally, there's a very big push to test all kits regardless. We don't actually support that. We support testing all kits where the victim wants to. Sexual assault is one of the few crimes where essentially a person's body becomes the evidentiary piece of the crime. I mean, it becomes the crime scene. And just the nature of that, how violating that can be, we believe that the victim should be able to control what happens after that point. And one of the biggest pieces that we have, because what we'll hear is somebody's known offender might be someone else's unknown offender, because we do know that a large or very small number of individuals commit the bulk of these sexual assaults. Very often it's not one or two individuals, it's multiple people. And I can appreciate that if I was sexually assaulted or raped by somebody and I didn't know who that perpetrator was, and the potential that somebody else's kit would let me know that, I can see why people would want to push for that. The flip side being, I may want a different path for my sexual assault or rape than another victim would want. And there is no protection, to the best of our knowledge right now under law, that wouldn't then compel that victim to have to be thrown into my case if I wanted to prosecute my case. Obviously, more victims lends credibility. And if somebody doesn't want to be outed as being a sexual assault or rape survivor, we don't believe they should be.
Tim never threatened me per se, but he definitely made me aware of the fact that when he was in our lives, that is the best we've ever had it. He had money. And so we lived very comfortably then. I could literally get anything I wanted from him. And so then he basically used that, I guess, to kind of buy my trust with it and buy my silence. I'm not really sure. Like, it wasn't necessarily talked about that way. He just, in a roundabout ways, he always kind of made it known that if he weren't in the picture, remember how our life would be then. Because it was pretty rough before. My mom being a single mom of 3 kids, and she was just a CNA. I mean, it's rough. And my grandparents had always helped out and did everything they could, but at the time that he was in our lives, it literally was the best we had ever sat financially. And so he made that definitely known if he wasn't in the picture that, you know, remember where we used to be. Do we want to go back to that? Of course not.
The abuse does manifest itself in another way, you know, in kind of aberrant behavior on the part of the victim oftentimes. Just because they're so angry, you know, that people that they trusted didn't protect them, or that more often the case, the people they trusted were the ones who abused them. And so they kind of lash out at adults or authority figures in their lives and kind of sabotage, you know, any progress that they make. And
I really hadn't dealt with it probably up until a few years ago. Like I said, I've been with my fiance for like going on 10 years now. And for the first probably 5, they were perfect. And then it's like out of nowhere, I can't have him touch me when I sleep. If he was like wanting to fool around one night and came into bed, and I used to just, I'd roll with it if I was already asleep and he'd come start cuddling and, you know, whatever. He can't do that anymore. I don't know what the difference is between now and then, but like I've punched him before. I've just fought him off. Like if I'm half asleep, like I feel like I was fighting off my stepdad, and he understands that. And I mean, it did kind of put a strain on like our sexual life a little bit, but he also understands.
You know, I think it's clear just from the movement around the country by each individual jurisdiction, the various states, all of whom, or many of whom in the last year, 2 years for sure, have lengthened considerably their civil statutes of limitations. Now, Iowa has made a change to their criminal statute of limitations here in the past legislative session, but they haven't done anything in years and years and years about the civil side. And it's odd because on the criminal side, they're recognizing as a public policy matter, the difficulty for the victim to come forward over here on the criminal side, but yet they're not making that same recognition on the civil side. To me, that seems odd, very odd, and I think it's driven by powerful forces, unseen hands, if you will, at the legislative level. So I don't think these people the victims are saying anything other than, give me my day in court. You know, if I'm not right, you'll defeat me there, I'm sure. But they all want their day in court. And, you know, all of the arguments that you hear about, well, it's too long, and, you know, all of those kinds of things. I've never had anybody say that in court, is that we can't defend ourselves because we don't know what happened. Almost always the defendants know what happened. They've just been reluctant to bring it forward.
I would tell you one of the second to shifting our culture, and I would say that some of that's happening. You know, like we've seen the MeToo movement, we've seen high-profile men being removed from their positions after, you know, dozens and dozens of victims come forward, and it's unfortunate that we have to get to a place where you have dozens and dozens of victims before we believe that this has occurred and that individual shouldn't be in a place of power to be able to potentially victimize others. So I do think the culture's shifting, but not quickly enough.
They're sending out a deputy to take his statement. All right, last time I checked, beating someone and raping someone was a freaking crime. Oh no, but they can't put him behind bars until the DNA kit comes back positive. So he can just keep going out and violating women like he did with the woman before myself? He had 3 probation violation strikes against him and not one freaking warrant out for his arrest for any of them. What the hell is this probation officer doing?
I would say it is a general rule that from a law enforcement side of things, our cases don't get better over time. Our best shot to collect evidence, make the strongest case possible, is very immediate in nature, within a relatively short time span. We get one shot at that, and so we have to make sure that we really take a broad perspective when thinking about the case. And that can often lead to some frustration on the part of a victim of a crime or the public in general, wanting to know, why isn't somebody charged? Why isn't somebody charged?
I found that out from the deputy who took my statement. He told me everything. He told me about the woman who got violated before myself, how she was violated in detail. I'm pretty sure that's not meant to happen.
We need a certain amount of information to arrest someone in the state of Iowa, and in most other jurisdictions that I'm aware of. A police officer needs what's called probable cause to charge a person with a crime. Probable cause, I mean, if you had to kind of put numbers to it or a percentage to it, probable cause is that it's there's enough evidence there to say, I believe this person may have committed this crime, right? It's not the same standard as what a prosecutor faces when they go to trial, which is beyond, you have to prove a charge beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a lower burden. So there's somewhat of a different standard between when a police officer makes a decision to arrest and when a prosecutor decides whether they can take it to trial.
So they take his statement and they tell him not to contact me. Okay, well, on the way to the hospital, not only does he message me several times, but he even attempts to make a phone call, which I did not answer. And I showed it to the park ranger who was driving. So he's already broken it 3 times. Several messages and a phone call. He's not listening to the police. They didn't do shit. Nothing. When I get home the next day, he's making life-threatening phone calls. He's blowing up my phone through Meet Me, through Snapchat, through wanting his stuff. Well, they kept his stuff. They told me that they were going to get everything they needed together for him. They were going to use his stuff as bait. And then within that week, when they got everything they needed, they were going to tell him, oh yeah, we've got your stuff, come down here, pick it up. And then they were going to arrest him. It's all a bunch of bullshit. Oh, they told me he could come down and get his stuff. They didn't arrest him. That's when they decided to tell me, oh no, rape kits take 6 months to a year to get back. And at this point, I'm being told that maybe I should get a no contact order. Huh? Why would I have to do that? How do I do that? What are you even talking about?
So let's say, we charge somebody with assault because they physically hit someone, but we're still investigating the sexual component of that to see if there's a sexual assault charge there. That is true in most regards, that we could charge them with one crime and hold them on that, and I have seen that done, where we've got enough to, or maybe like they were intoxicated or something. When we stopped them, they were driving a vehicle while under the influence, so we arrest them for the operating while intoxicated charge, while we continue to investigate the sexual assault component. And that can be charged at a later time. There are concerns there that officers have to be aware of and prosecutors have to be aware of. Of course, when you formally charge somebody with a crime, like OWI, they have certain rights, like right to an attorney. They've got their Miranda rights. So before they're questioned, they would have to, if they're in custody and before they're questioned, they have to be advised that they have a right to remain silent, that right to an attorney. And when you've got one crime charged and one not, you have to be careful that the lines aren't blurred there and that you respect all the rights for the defendant that they get once they're arrested and accused of a crime. so that doesn't interfere with or hamper your other investigation. Subsequently, a defendant could file a motion, we call it a motion to suppress in Iowa, suppress evidence, that let's say they contend that you violated their rights because when you arrested them on a charge, they asked for an attorney or something, but you continued to question them about other matters, that could result in all charges being thrown out. The one charged at that time and the one later charged subsequently. So you have to be aware of those things if you charge them under one crime and not another.
My biological father, who I've also now have a relationship with, I met him when I was 16. He used to live in Arizona. He also dealt with drugs. He was hard on cash and, ran in with some people and was trafficking for some Iranians from Arizona to Chicago. He made like $15,000. I mean, when you're hard on cash and you're driving, so he ended up getting caught though, and he got 10 years in federal prison for just driving some pot. I mean, I get that it was against the law, and yeah, I mean, he took his punishment and he dealt with it. He ended up getting out when Obama was in office and, passed the whatever act with the nonviolent drug offenders. So he ended up getting out early.
There's a Class D felony, a Class C felony, Class B, and at the very top is Class A. Class A is usually what we think of the most heinous crimes in the state: murder, first-degree murder, kidnapping in the first degree. Those offenses are usually, the punishment is life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Class A offense, because they're going to prison for life, there's usually not a fine attached to that. But for the D, C, and B felonies, the fine goes up again from those serious misdemeanor and aggravated misdemeanors. But once again, most D felonies have the same fine, most C. So whether it's a sex abuse that's a C felony or a willful injury that's a C felony, those two offenses are going to have the same fine. The legislature, when they made the laws, did in their discretion oftentimes attach a higher fine specifically for drug offenses, as you were referring to. I can't tell you the reasoning for that. My speculation might be that they were trying to balance maybe less time of incarceration if that person received a higher fine for a drug offense. So instead of sending them to prison, the judge may not send them to prison for a drug offense because they realize they're going to be getting a significant financial penalty for a violation of that crime.
But I mean, yeah, it hurts me to think that he got such a harsh punishment for what he did, which didn't hurt anybody. And honestly, he was bringing pot, which is medicine in some people's eyes, to others. And I mean, again, he wasn't hurting or doing anything, but then Tim Slavin, my stepfather, does what he does to me, and I'm scarred literally for life, and he got probation. Like, where's the justice in that? There is none.
And through this whole process, I have yet to have a single conversation, not one single word, with the Hamilton County attorney. I've been told when to call. I've been told how I'm supposedly supposed to get a hold of him. Every time I try, I can't get a hold of him. I've left umpteen messages. Couldn't get a hold of him. When I found out about the plea deal they were trying to go behind my back with, I was so pissed.
It wouldn't be fair to speak for other people, but certainly a consideration that's always at the forefront of my mind when I engage in a plea deal is it allows a prosecutor to obtain some form of certainty of outcome of a case. I have a lot of discretion and a lot of say about charges, but ultimately, whether a person is found guilty or not may rest in the hands of a judge or a jury. I will do the best I can if it goes to trial to convince those jurors that the person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but that decision is ultimately out of my hands. And I can't guarantee an outcome of how that's going to happen if it goes to trial. Reasonable minds can differ. There are 12 people on a jury. It only takes one of those people to disagree with my assessment of the case for it to end up in a hung jury or possibly an acquittal. And therefore, there's a little bit of uncertainty anytime you go to a trial. Even if you think you have the strongest case in the world, there is no guarantee that you're going to get a conviction. And it helps to give a little more certainty, not only to the prosecutor, but sometimes most importantly, to the victim of the offense. If you go to trial, it may be a roll of the dice, and that's an all or nothing proposition. You either get your conviction, which is a possibility. There's also a possibility that this person could walk away scot-free without any consequences whatsoever. So that is a real driver of plea negotiations, plea discussions, plea offers, to get that certainty of outcome, to get a certain conviction, and to get a say in what the sentence is going to be. I mean, to get that certainty, you usually have to give something up. It's a bargain. It's a deal made. And a defendant isn't just going to plead to the charge when they have a right to a trial on it. Usually there has to be some benefit for them because our side's getting the benefit of a certain outcome and a certain conviction. And so that's why there's oftentimes pled to maybe a lesser offense, or maybe there's an agreement for probation versus prison. Both sides are giving up something to get this certain outcome.
It was hard enough trying to prepare to be in the same courtroom with him, because I didn't want to show any weakness. I didn't want to show. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. He wasn't going to get any more of me than he already took. And then when it's time for the victim impact statements, I get up there, and the whole time I'm trying to read this thing, he's pointing and laughing and making gestures to his attorney and all this, and not once did the judge tell him to stop.
Mandatory sentence has been a topic of discussion for quite some time, not only in relation to sexual assault cases, but in particular on a national scale to drug offenses. There are pros and cons to mandatory sentences. There is an argument that a mandatory sentence provides some sort of deterrent in that people see, if I commit this offense, there's no argument, I don't get probation, I go to prison. And that would deter them from committing the crime. On the other side though, we've had a lot of discussion so far about the importance of discretion in the criminal justice system and being able to look at each case individually and not treating them all in a cookie cutter fashion. Mandatory sentences can take away a lot of that discretion and a lot of those options.
Yeah, and then when he stood up for his sentencing, he's making wisecracks with the judge. And the judge is allowing it, and then he starts making jokes with the judge, and him and the judge are laughing back and forth with each other, and I'm just like, am I awake? Is this seriously happening? Okay, he's getting sentenced. a BS sentence on top of it, but it's sentencing.
A number of years ago, there was a change in the rules of evidence that said if a person had previously, or even there was adequate evidence to show that they had engaged in a previous sexual assault, you could talk about that in a new sexual assault case. It was something that prosecutors viewed favorably, because we know that the highest rates of recidivism for almost any crime are highest with sexual assault cases. We know that there is often a pattern or practice to the way people perpetrate sexual abuses. And so if you could show evidence that somebody had engaged in that in the past and it matched what was currently charged as a crime, that was powerful evidence that this person probably did what was alleged in the current crime. Subsequently, case law restricted that very much. They said, well, you can still talk about those prior sexual abuse instances, but only if it was with the same victim. The different victim, that was considered too prejudicial, that it would tend to make people just convict the defendant because they didn't like the defendant versus the actual evidence. So the court was not going to allow that in, but restricted what you could talk about, even though that rule tried to open it up some. They pulled it back a little bit. So there may be evidence known to the prosecutor, to law enforcement, that this person has perpetrated maybe multiple sexual offenses before. Might have even been known to the victim. Let's say it was a family member or something that had previously been convicted of assaulting another family member, and then they were alone with this child and alleged to have perpetrated a sex abuse on that child. The family members may have all known that this person had previously committed a sex abuse, but the jury or the judge, if the judge hears that, may never know that evidence, because we can't get into that because it's deemed too prejudicial. If the society wants to improve the ability to hold offenders accountable and to potentially deter offenders from committing these offenses, I guess I would be of the opinion that it would be more useful to law enforcement and prosecutors to make changes in what we can talk about at trial, what evidence we can use, versus mandatory sentences. Mandatory sentences sound very good. It's like tough on crime, but a lot of times, like I said, it can make those plea negotiations, treating cases differently and trying to give due justice in each case, harder.
The biggest thing is always make sure someone knows where you're at, who you're with, and what you're doing. That way, if something does go wrong, they know where to start.
It's not okay that Iowa is okay with the fact that we just let these crimes happen to kids and, don't properly handle it. We don't serve justice like we're supposed to. And basically just says it's okay by all the people that get off with it. But I also hope it sends a message to any other victims that, as much as it hurts, I'm still living, I still have my daily battles, but I'm, happy and I'm living life, and it might break you for the time being, but you're not broken, and you can always pick yourself back up and move on.
I guess what I would like to say is how important it is to speak up. How important it is for everyone to have a voice and to hold people accountable for their actions.